Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Christian Horner has made it very clear that Red Bull are not happy at all with the changes to the FIA technical directive due to come in for the Spanish Grand Prix in a few rounds into the Formula 1 season for 2025. The Flexi-Wings were a big conversation topic of last year, and Red Bull clearly on Horner's comments have wasted substantial resources on developing a flexible wing program, which is now going to be out of the door just a few rounds in. McLaren are very happy about these circumstances. Red Bull are most certainly not. Have they wasted a ton of budget and resources on developing a car which is not going to be valid in a few rounds' time? Will Max Verstappen need to have an excellent start to the season if he wants any hope to win this championship? Therefore, again, very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. As always, I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, the Aston Martin has been revealed. It was confirmed, the AMR 25, just a couple of hours ago. I will just share this in the background. Quick epilepsy warning for you all, because this does get kind of dramatic. And I will say that wherever Saudi Arabia seem to put their investments, right, so of course Aramco are getting involved in the Aston Martin side, and in the Call of Duty stuff that I also cover, they have a team now in the league over there. Their graphic design and the work they put on that side is always just so good. I mean, this video from Aston Martin is pretty mega, I'm not gonna lie. Everything about it is completely spectacular, and this is the reveal of their new AMR 25. It will hit the track officially tomorrow. We saw the livery a few days ago in London, but of course that wasn't the real thing, which matters to some degree. Even look at this, right, where they have the side pod and then the kind of car comes along the side pod. Like, these guys are cooking up something pretty, well, it's kind of a masterclass, isn't it? Let's be honest here. And this is the new machine for the new season. Is it going to be any good? They've said that it's basically 99%, 100% new compared to last year's Aston Martin, which presumably is true, but still, is it 99% new in a positive way? I think that's going to be the question that people are actually having on this topic, because it was not a great car last year. It obviously started out well at the start of 2023, but these are some of the images of the new car, right, for 2025. And okay, it's an Aston Martin. It looks nice, you know, British racing green and all that. Probably the most notable thing to look at, first of all, is just the overbite on the side pods. That's probably what's gathering most attention. And the reality is, when it comes down to these renders, you're never going to be able to tell that much, because the render is likely to be based on a concept that they're no longer employing. It's probably a few, you know, rounds of revisions ago. This particular concept, what they turn up with in Bahrain in testing, is probably going to look slightly different to this anyway. I'm sure people are going to compare. As I say, the big thing is probably the overbite on the side pods is notably different to what we have previously seen. And, well, it looks like a Red Bull in some regard, based on what's happened over the last couple of years. It is, I wouldn't say it's a shame, it's just inevitable. But all the side pods nowadays on the new cars basically look the same. You guys, of course, will remember back in 2022 when we had some various ideas for how to design the shapes of the cars. But fundamentally, this looks like most other cars look here in 2025. Will it be fast is a question. They say that they've tried basically everything at Aston Martin to make this situation better, but we also know that Adrian Newey's primary focus is going to be on 2026, not exactly working on this car. But of course, notably, tomorrow is going to be a shakedown for Aston Martin in Bahrain. So everyone's there now in the paddock, getting ready for testing in just a couple of days' time. I think Mercedes and Red Bull, they're doing their shakedown the next day with their car on the track for the first time. So the next couple of days is the first time we're really going to get to see what the Aston, the Merc, the Red Bull actually look like in reality, because, you know, it's all good showing us a render, it's all good showing us the livery, but the reason why there's a lot of talk about Ferrari and McLaren and other teams like that, mostly those two teams, is because they've actually shown us the real car. Teams that haven't, of course, it becomes more difficult to discuss. Just quickly on the Doohan Colapinto thing, this drama is going to continue until probably Doohan eventually gets the sack. But Briatore has commented on this and said, I'm not a killer, I just want to have the best drivers possible. So read between the lines on that in whatever way you would like to. There was also a big update today from the Grand Prix Drivers Association. Now, if you didn't know, this was actually from the GPDA. You'd think that this was just someone's designed this in Microsoft Paint. But no, I guess George Russell's been putting things together himself, because this is what they come out with today. The GPDA welcomes Carlos Sainz as director. Stepping into the role vacated by Sebastian Vettel, Sainz becomes a director of the Grand Prix Drivers Association alongside George Russell, Anastasia Fowle, and chairman Alex Wurz. Hashtag Racing United for our safety, our sport, and our fans. Pretty interesting, because I think Vettel, since of course stepping away from the sport, has maybe been a consultant to the GPDA, but he's not been a director since he retired after 2022. And here he is posting it on his story, so you can show that this actually was a real set of images that came out today. Now, very interesting this, I'd say, because the F1 and the FIA are more at odds now than they have been in a long time. Certainly the F1 drivers more at odds with the FIA and Ben Sulayem than they have felt in a long time. Sainz himself was actually one of the most vocal drivers. To be fair, Williams were like the only team to actually do a proper press conference, but when they did the press conference with Sainz and Albon revealing their car before what happens on the 18th of February in London, Sainz and Albon were asked questions on the way the FIA are approaching things, the fines, the potential punishments, the bans, the restrictions on points and all this stuff, like points of deductions that are being talked about for swearing in press conferences and on the radio and all this madness. Sainz was one of the most vocal drivers against this, and now he's officially getting involved in the GPDA. So these were some of the other pictures, right? I thought it was pretty funny. So yeah, in the middle here we had this picture of Carlos Sainz. I love how they've not got one where he's fully cropped in, if you know what I'm saying. Like, obviously this has just been taken off Google, so you can't even see the far left-hand side of the image, but whatever. Sainz gives his thoughts and says, "I'm passionate about my sport, and I think we as drivers have a responsibility to do all we can to work with the stakeholders to forward this sport in many aspects. So I'm very happy and proud to do my part by taking on the director's role." And Alex Wurz comments on it as well here on the right-hand side. So, says he's been an engaged and active member of the team, but clearly there is some frustration between the drivers and the way that things are going with the governing body, and Sainz feels like it's his time to step up and do his bit for the sport and take the challenge to the FIA even further than normal. So George Russell, of course, kind of still the top guy in some respects. He's the guy that people look to as like, okay, Russell, the spokesperson. But getting Sainz on board as well, I think it's a pretty interesting and maybe a pretty substantial step at that as well. And understandably, there were plenty of tweets hitting the timeline as a result of this. So are the FIA going to be running scared as Sainz and Russell are going to be putting on a bit of a masterclass when it comes down to calling out Ben Sulayem and making sure that some of these negotiations and discussions lean towards F1 and the drivers, slightly more so than they lean the other way? Look, at the end of the day, do I think the drivers always make the best decisions on things? No, but should they have a say? Should the governing body not just decide everything, which it seems they presently do? And especially on this swearing stuff, it's like the fans, the drivers, Formula One, the teams are generally in agreement with what they think the governing body are on the other side of it. So, that's a big one I'm sure they'll be pushing for going forwards. But also things like when they get fined, where does the money go? These are questions that Russell has had, but they don't seem to be getting answered in a satisfactory way. Before we discuss the Red Bull drama, quickly on Ferrari, because again, we have a real car for the SF25, so we can talk about it. Whereas the other cars, many of them anyway, we don't have a real car to actually look at yet. But Auto Racer were looking at the Ferrari and discussing the rear suspension, right? Because the front suspension, Ferrari are going pull rod. And that's what they've not done for ages. It's been a push rod configuration, push rod geometry. The other teams, certainly McLaren and Red Bull, they've gone pull rod front suspension over the last few years, whereas Ferrari, they were the opposite completely to Red Bull, because Red Bull go pull rod front, push rod rear. That's what Newey designs back in 2022 for them, and they've stuck with that ever since. Ferrari have gone push rod front, pull rod rear over the last few years. This year, though, they're changing to pull rod front suspension. I know the terminology is kind of a minefield, but they're not changing their rear suspension. That's the point. So it's going to be pull rod at the Ferrari. And as Auto Racers say, probably the only car that's going to do that. Now, there has been a theory going around over the last couple of years that the engineers believe in this cycle of regulations, certainly at the front suspension, the pull rod is the way to go. It gives you a higher potential ceiling, certainly on the aerodynamic side. look, the suspension effectively does the same thing, but the way that it operates is different, and the way that the wishbones interact is different, and therefore the airflow that you can generate is different as well. So, apparently that's the reason why teams have favoured it. But at the rear, it doesn't seem to massively matter. That's at least what the engineers seem to believe. But because Newey designs pull rod push rods, that's basically what the other teams have done. Whereas Ferrari say no, at the rear, the pull rod is still fine. There's no reason why we've got to switch to the push rod concept. And what they do say is that what they have allowed is that an increasing, basically, volume in the final part of the floor, so they can generate more downforce. But the other piece is on the configuration of the components, because they know what their pull rod does, and they can figure a few ideas around how they optimize the setup of the configuration of the components, basically. The gearbox has apparently been partly lowered to lower part of the mechanical attachments, an innovation design above all, therefore, to improve the rear aero. They're also talking about the diffuser that they're working on, and this may be one of those ideas that supposedly a Ferrari engineer said a couple of weeks ago nobody else has thought of. Maybe nobody else has thought of it just because they're really the only ones still using this suspension concept, but still, the point is, for Ferrari, if they can optimize the package at the rear, they can reduce the friction on the air. I think that's one of the ideas, because certainly at this part of the regulations, there's less focus on maximizing downforce, there's more focus on maximizing straight line speeds and aerodynamic efficiency. And if they can configure the parts in a better way that they understand well, because they're sticking with the pull rod concept at the rear, that may help them more than a change may help them in another way. But it is interesting anyway that of all of the pieces, every car on the grid is going to have probably different suspension geometries, front and rear. Ferrari is going to be the same. Even Haas will have different, because they're sticking with last year's push rod front suspension from Ferrari. So when you go different to other teams, it could be because you're making a mistake, but Ferrari have done this before and it hasn't really seemed to affect them massively, or it could be it's not going to matter, or it could potentially be a source of some degree of advantage. But of course, if they take too much risk, then it could potentially backfire. But of course, that is also the same for other teams as well. Let's talk Red Bull though, because there was some drama yesterday. Verstappen and Horner, of course, were booed at the F175 event. Apparently Max isn't very happy about it, or maybe he's just using it as an excuse to not go back to one of these events again. I'm not going to get into the details on that again. We talked about it in yesterday's video. What I'm going to get into though is some other drama at Red Bull, because as of late, there's been lots of talk about flexible wings. The flexi rear wings, what we saw from McLaren back in Baku, that has been outlawed. You're no longer going to be able to have a mini DRS effect as McLaren were exploiting back then. And apparently Rob Marshall, he has been the man when it comes down to this type of stuff. This is Rob Marshall here, if you guys know this face, and this is when he was at Red Bull, of course, but over the last couple of years, McLaren managed to poach him away, and it seems like he is, well, one of the key faces and names and brains, frankly, behind the development of their very successful project over the last couple of years. So Rob Marshall is known to be a bit of a wizard when it comes down to flexible wing technology. And last year, McLaren were the leaders and the pioneers in that regard, front and rear wing. Of course, the idea really being for the teams that the more they can allow the front wing to flex under high loads, increases their straight line speeds, because it's able to flex into a position where it's generating less downforce at very high speeds. So your drag to downforce ratio is better on the straights than it would be in the corners where you need it. But also at high speed corners, it can improve the balance of the car because it's not generating too much performance, and therefore meaning that the rear is trying to step out on you. So there's a few reasons why in this particular set of regulations, the flexibility of the wings has been a massive point of development over the last couple of years. Now, McLaren, and to be fair, Mercedes to some degree, led the way on that last season. And this year there was a big question as to whether they would change their mind, or whether the FIA would say, you know what guys, it might be kind of against the spirit of the rules, and because we can only test to certain levels of newtons in a static test, and there's actually way more load than that being generated by these cars at the speeds that they can get to, you can kind of break the rules and we can't really stop you. That is how it is, and that's, to be honest, still how it is. But what they can test, they have reduced the flexibility by about a third from the 9th race and beyond. There is some questions as to whether the engineers will be very smart and find ways to manufacture the elasticity curves so that they can potentially still bend an awful lot, but not necessarily at the lower speeds and the lower Newton levels that the FIA will be testing on. But the reality is that from the 9th Grand Prix and beyond from Spain, it is very likely that the teams will have to change the wings they have on their car because the current wings will no longer pass the test. Now, when this was first talked about at the start of February, there was a big question as to who was happy about this and who wasn't, because on paper you think, oh, McLaren, they're going to be fuming, they've been leading the way. But actually, it's potentially precisely the opposite. McLaren have been leading the way, Red Bull have been playing catch-up massively, and now, obviously, it's going to get shut down. So Red Bull are not very happy about that. Now, there was some debate at the time as to whether this was actually true or not, because if McLaren are happy about it, you know, you wouldn't imagine Red Bull would be too mad, because otherwise McLaren would be annoyed as well, wouldn't you think? Because they're not making maybe the gains that they could have made. But McLaren say, this is going to be fine, no issues. And this is when Christian Horner has now weighed into it as well. So De Kester and the guys at Auto Racer have another article on this, and I thought what they said was kind of funny, but this is what I just mentioned on the aero elasticity and the changes they are making from Spain and beyond. So Horner has said the following. Now, I like the way that they write this article. We had anticipated that Red Bull was the angriest team for this unexpected change that occurred between the end of November and the first half of December, and that McLaren was not worried, but rather in favour of the introduction of the TD. Some English reports had tried to harshly tone things down, even speaking of conspiracies, in bold, written by Auto Racer, the article that's writing this, both regarding Red Bull's anger regarding the budget and regarding McLaren's endorsement of the new directive, even though the Papaya team was the one best placed in terms of flexibility together with Mercedes. So, you know, what they are saying is that some British media were trying to say that they were making things up, but actually Horner has effectively implies that what Auto Racer initially said was true, because Horner said this: it's a positive that the FIA has addressed the issue, even if it is undeniable that there has been a change of heart. More than anything, I do not understand why there should be a change at the 9th race, because this essentially means we will have 2 championships, up to before the 9th race and after the 9th race, and this will only increase costs considerably. So Red Bull and Horner clearly is not happy about it. It was actually Don Adoni that put this article here together rather than De Kester, but still, the point still stands that Horner doesn't seem especially happy. What's interesting, though, is that McLaren don't seem to mind. So the fact that Horner sees it as 2 different championships, as in, well, at least according to what Red Bull are suggesting, they are going to have to make substantial changes from the Spanish Grand Prix and beyond, from race 9 until race 24. Maybe McLaren feel they won't have to change all that much for whatever reason. But yeah, Red Bull definitely are suggesting that they've spent considerable cost developing their wing flexibility technology to execute at the start of this upcoming season, where McLaren potentially were at the end of last year. And all of that time and money they've put into that will become useless by the 9th Grand Prix of the year. And that's a big deal, right? Because McLaren has been able to put those key resources that Red Bull have spent and time they've used in the wind tunnel, they've been able to use that McLaren elsewhere. Of course, Red Bull third in the constructors, they get more wind tunnel time, but they don't get more money to spend. So, you know, it's obviously a big issue for Red Bull. Could give advantage to McLaren, advantage to Ferrari potentially as well. And maybe the takeaway is that Red Bull need to come out the gates hard, because if Max comes out the gates like he did last season, winning the championship is absolutely a very realistic possibility, as it was this year. But if he comes out the gates like he was at the end of this most recent season, in the mix, but not often winning and not always scoring podiums, then by the time the Spanish Grand Prix comes around, it might just be over, right? Because if what Red Bull are suggesting is true, that they're going to lose some performance there, and to be fair, maybe that's not fully the perspective, maybe they can develop the alternate wings they need to comply with the regulations, but that means that they will not have the money or time to develop later on. So from race, let's say 16, race 17, they won't have an upgrade that they would ideally like to have because they've got to spend the time on this. So that's going to affect them, and it's also going to affect what they do for 2026 as well. But no doubt the Red Bull aren't very happy about things. Are Red Bull ever happy about things? I'm not so sure, but very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.